Welcome back to the Docker with .NET section of the Getting Started with Docker course. In this lesson, we're going to be building out a basic web application. So let's get started in Visual Studio. And we'll come down here and create a new project. Inside here, we're going to look for an ASP.NET Core web application. We'll hit Next. And we're going to need to give it a name. Let's call our web project Basic Docker. And our solution name will be Basic Docker App. You'll hit Create, and we'll get a few more options here. First one is what type of framework do you want? .NET Core, .NET Framework. We want .NET Core, ASP.NET Core 2.2. It's going to be good. We're going to choose the web application, which will give us Razor pages. They're kind of fun and easy to use. We're not going to add authentication, but there is a checkbox here that says Enable Docker Support, which requires Docker Desktop. We get to choose, do you want Linux or Windows? Since we're using .NET Core, we can choose either one. And on my machine, I've configured it for Linux. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to use Linux for this. So we're going to enable Docker support right from here. Make sure that's checked. And make sure it's checked to configure for HTTPS. Okay, and now we hit Create. This will take a couple of seconds to scaffold out our basic project. So notice down the bottom here, it's restoring, well, that was quick. It was restoring NuGet packages. And they're pretty much restored. Now it's starting the initial build process to pull the images that it's missing, and specifically this image right here, which is the ASP.NET 2.2 Stretch Slim. Just kind of preloading those images for us. Remember when we had to build our first Hello World Docker container? It downloaded that image first and then continued the process of building. Well, Microsoft knows that you don't want to wait for a big download. No matter how big or small the download is, you don't want to wait for it when you're first building. So they actually pull the images you need beforehand using the Docker pull command. That way, you don't have to wait for them. So if I pull up my PowerShell right here, and let's make it a little bigger, and we say Docker images, notice I have basic Docker, and I have mcr.microsoft.com, all the way through to 2.2 Stretch Slim. So it's downloaded this version right here, and oh, by the way, it's built our basic Docker dev container. And that's 45 seconds ago. And the size is 260 megabytes for that one file. Now the other one, it says 260 megabytes, but it's really just a megabyte or two on top of this image. So it has already run the Docker build command once just to get us started and prepped so it doesn't take as long the second time. Now if we look at Docker ps-a, you'll notice there are no containers. It hasn't created a container for us, just the image. So now I was looking at that in the container tools from the output window. If you don't have this, and if you don't have this containers tab over here, what you can do is go to Extensions, Manage Extensions, and then there is a Docker extension. It's here somewhere. All right, Visual Studio Container Tools extension. So it's called Visual Studio Container Tools extension, and what that does is it allows you to have this really helpful containers tab, and it allows you to have that ability to look at what the container is doing. So we'll look at what this tab does in a little bit. If you don't see this tab, but you have installed that, go to your View menu, go to Other Windows, execute. In fact, let's just do that. So it's going to start up a web server in a command window, and it's going to try and open up a new version of web browser, which it did, and there we go. Localhost HTTPS on port 5001, and now we have our basic demo website. And that's all in that window here. But now let's run it again, and this time what we're going to do is select Docker instead, because that was just running right on our machine. Let's run it in Docker. So I hit run, and it's going to start up a new container for us. Now let's, instead of going to debug, let's go to the, whoop, it's already open. Let's bring that over. Instead of, notice it's on port 44322 on HTTPS, but it is there. So how does that work? Well, let's go over to, it's too quick for me. Let's go to Container Tools. And we'll scroll down here, and we'll see that we have done a Docker run, and there's a whole bunch of other stuff. We'll get into that in another lesson or two, but we did a Docker run on our image. Now, if I go over here to my Containers tab, we'll see that Pensive Yonath is our container name, and it's currently running. Notice it's kind of hard to see, but if you mouse over it, it says that it's running. Also has a green little arrow icon. We also have a stop button and a remove button. So you can actually stop the container, start it up again, or remove the container, all from this tab in Visual Studio. They're trying to make it as easy as possible to work with containers when you're using .NET tools. So here's the information about the container. So there's a lot here. Well, actually don't show a ton right now, but there is some here. But then also like ports, you can see, hey, it's actually listening to port 80, but that's on my machine, it's 50,035, where the HTTPS is on port 443 internally, but on my machine it's 44322. There's no logs, but we do have a look at all the files. We can actually browse through the files on our container. So you can look through here and look for our files and where they are. And actually look and find, hey, there's games. So there's no games in that folder. But we can actually browse through and see what's in our Docker container. That can be kind of helpful. Okay, so they're kind of elevating it even beyond what we've done at the command line. Now we can go over to our PowerShell and look at Docker ps-a and see that yes, basic Docker, the dev version, that's the image, and we've created with it Pensive Yonath, and it's currently up the past 2 minutes, and we've mapped out port 50,035 to port 80 internally, and port 44322 to 443 internally. So we've got all this information still. We can still see it. We can actually do things like stop the container and restart. We can even do a Docker inspect and say, let's look at 141. That's the container name, or the start of it. We can see all the information about this container, which is a lot of information here. So it is Docker, and it is, it's doing all the same things we do with the command line, except the cool thing is with Microsoft, it really is just point and click. There's not a lot to it. Now, we still want to understand what Docker is doing, and because we're not always going to use the Visual Studio debugger. And right now we are using the debugger, which does a lot of extra stuff. And so we'll talk about that in the next lesson. But for now, we're just going to talk about the fact that yes, it's running. Yes, we can stop it here. And so if I stop it and then I go over to my window here. Let's make sure it's stopped. It did. It's not quite stopped yet. It's still stopping. Docker. It is a full image. There is a lot of stuff behind the scenes that can be a little more confusing. We're going to go through that in the next lesson. But the basics are it just works. Everything it builds. It's the build. And then it publishes it and it deploys it. So just out of the box, really simple. It just works. So we're going to stop there in this lesson, but we're going to come back to this file right away in the next lesson and kind of walk through what's going on here. We want to understand from a company that's put a lot of time and effort into doing this right. We want to understand how they do it and how they think about building these containers. Okay, so come on back for that in the next lesson.